Before getting to St. Thomas Aquinas' third way, the way of possibility and necessity, we have to talk a bit about the philosophical concepts of the possible, the necessary, and the actual. And these will be similar to how we use them normally, but they do have some specific philosophical technicalities. Now, when we talk about the possible in normal everyday life, we mean something that can be but need not be. And that matches the philosophical use pretty closely. But there are some differences. So philosophers, also science fiction writers, talk about things that are possible, the things that could be, but perhaps are not. For example, people like to talk about in science fiction and philosophy, also physics, talk about possible worlds. Worlds that could be, that are like ours in some ways, but different in others. So philosophically speaking, what is possible is what can be, but need not be. And you can lay aside kind of the metaphysics of possible worlds and so forth, and simply look at things in terms of what is merely possible is something that can perish. Because it can be, but doesn't need to be. It doesn't have to be. So possible beings can exist, but it's not that they must exist. Which takes us to the necessary. Now, in normal everyday life, when people talk about what is necessary or necessities, they typically mean things they gotta have, like how food is necessary for life, or, oxygen and water necessary for life. Now, in this context, necessary doesn't mean like a necessity, like you've got to have it. It means what must be, what cannot not be. Now, we'll see later when we talk about other philosophers, when they talk about necessary truths. And necessary truth is a truth that is true, and it must be true. It cannot be false. For example, triangles having three sides is a good example of this. It's true, and it can never not be true, because no matter what kind of triangle you got, it's got three sides. But the claim that a particular triangle is blue, well, that would be true if you had a blue triangle, but if you repainted it, then it would be false. So triangles necessarily are three-sided, but it's possible for them to be blue or other colors. Now, when it comes to a necessary being, it's a being that must exist and cannot not exist. Now, if you want to talk about possible worlds, a necessary being would exist in every possible world. They would have to be there because they must exist. And effectively, if they were truly a necessary being, metaphysically speaking, they would be effectively indestructible because they would always have to be. They could not be, gotten rid of, which would be, a pretty good superpower to have. Now, there's also what is actual, and this corresponds to how we use it in normal everyday life. If we say something is actually, true, or this is actually the case, we mean what really is. So an actual being is one that would exist. A possible being is one that need not exist. Now, you could have a being that is actual and possible, namely that it does exist, but it doesn't have to. And of course, necessary beings would always be actual because they cannot not exist. So now that we got the setup out of the way, the possible is what can be but need not be, the necessary is what must be, cannot not be, and we have the actual what is. We can head into the third way, possibility and necessity. As with all these ways, he begins with an empirical observation as his starting point. And he says, we find in nature things that are possible to be and not be. They can be generated and corrupted. That is, they can be born and they can die. They can be created and destroyed. So it's possible for them to be and not be. Now, Aquinas claims that it's impossible for these always to exist because he assumes, and this is a critical assumption, that whatever cannot be at some time will at some time not be. So he reasons this way. Therefore, if everything in the world cannot be, then at one time there was nothing in existence. So what he's essentially saying is, if everything was merely possible, that it could go out of existence or could not exist, he infers that at one time there would be nothing, which is a critical assumption. And from this he believes that it follows, if this were true, nothing would exist now. Because, this is another critical assumption, that which does not exist begins to exist only through something already existing. Put in more everyday terms, you can't get something from nothing. Now, later philosophers will also use this. For example, our good dead friend Descartes will make use of this, as will others. It's a common concept in philosophy, and it's sometimes called no ex nihilo creation, mixing some Latin and English. Ex nihilo, from nothing. Again, you can't get something from nothing. So he continues his reasoning. Therefore, if at one time nothing existed, it would have been impossible for anything to have begun to exist. What would this mean? Well, it would follow that now there would be nothing in existence. There'd be nothing now. But this is clearly absurd. So he ends up in a reductio ad absurdum. That is, quick recap of it would be, quick summary recap would be, if everything can go out of existence, at one point there'd be nothing. You can't get something from nothing. We'd have nothing now. But we clearly don't got nothing. We clearly have something. Therefore, there must be a necessary being that must exist. So not all beings are merely possible. Now, you might think at this point he would stop and say, voila, God. But no, he hasn't run his infinite regress yet, and apparently he's got to get in the infinite regress, at least in most cases. So how does he run the infinite regress here? Well, here's how it goes. He claims that every necessary thing either has its necessity caused by another or not. Put another way, if you have a necessary being, either it's necessary in and of itself, or it gets its necessity from something else. Now, and here's where he runs the regress. It is impossible, he claims, to go on to infinity in necessary things which have their necessity caused by another. And as he notes, you could rerun the argument from efficient causes, except just throw in necessity. So he infers, we must admit the being exists that is necessary. It has of itself its own necessity. It doesn't get its necessity from another, and it causes, and all other necessary beings, their necessity. And as always, he closes with, this all men speak of as God. Now, what would it be for something to get its necessity from something else? Well, one example comes from our good dead friend Leibniz. Leibniz took the view that God could create anything he wants. He has, the power and the will to do so. But of course, he, as we'll see in the future, he creates the best of all possible worlds. And Leibniz also held that when God creates, say, Socrates, to be Socrates, must of necessity have all the qualities that make up Socrates. So once God puts Socrates into existence, all that Socrates is, it's necessary that Socrates do those things. So like he goes on trial in the Apology. That's part of what it is to be Socrates. And so that would be what you could call weirdly a contingent necessity. If God didn't create Socrates, then Socrates wouldn't exist and he wouldn't be a philosopher. But if Socrates does exist, he's necessarily a philosopher. He must be a philosopher. Now, if you make this really meta, it would be that God would create beings that are necessary, but they're created by him, and he gives them their necessity, because if he didn't create them, they wouldn't be. And this, of course, kind of smushes up the notion of necessity, because if you're necessary, you've got to exist. But God, of course, seems to break many of the rules. And so that is the way of possibility and necessity. If you didn't have a necessary being, you'd have nothing. We got something, you got to have a necessary being. So then we'll now turn to a look at the fourth way, the way of gradation, which will be next up in the 5 ways.